let me introduce Chris. Chris Dunn is a strategic fire planner with a lot of work on the West Coast in particular. He's been I first came across his work in around 2020 when one of the regional collaboratives that I work with was advocating developing a large strategic planning effort that was centered on the potential operational delineations. And that effort turned to be an incredibly influential project for many of the groups that I was working with. This particular meeting kind of came somewhat from the summer meeting we when we were in Seattle. Was when there was cancellation of federal funding for public broadcasters. And one of the things that kind of came up in the conversation, particularly with Claire Sturm, Nick Maggio, was the potential for and the importance of regional communication mediums to communicate our data science products. And so Chris had some very important specific experience with this. And with that, I'll let him take it away.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Tim. Let me make sure I can get screen share for you. Yep. Good. Anyone? Can you see that?
Yep,
yeah.
you're good.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
I was muted.
Sure.
I didn't realize.
Make sure we're there first. So thanks, Tim, for the introduction. Yeah, a little bit more about my background is I come out of fire management as a firefighter many years ago now, and now I'm much more entrenched in the academic side of this, and really some data analytics to support sort of risk management and wildfire response through the perspectives of risk with many colleagues in the Forest Service and otherwise, including Tim and the engagements that we've had over the years. Over the last 4 years, something that's really been occupying my time is working with our state legislature at their request and the request by a law that they passed back in 2021 that we move forward some defensible space and home hardening standards for the state of Oregon, much like California has had for quite some time. Added to this, so they really wanted was the defensible space requirements, which we'll talk a little bit more about what they are really driving for, which was unique because home hardening standards are more common through building codes and that sort of thing. But folding in that defensible space was unique, and something that Oregon seemingly was leading on. But it quickly was derailed, and that's really what I'm here to talk about. That despite all our efforts to produce a scientifically based product to support the state legislation, that it ran into significant challenges, we'll just say. And so I'll go through that process. It's been about a 4-year effort and has recently concluded. And as you can see, I title this Oregon's wildfire risk, hazard mapping experience or debacle. I tend to characterize it like this for 2 reasons. One is that when the legislation first came out, it was this map was referred to as risk, which was never really what the map was representing. It really was a hazard map that was subsequently updated and corrected in future legislation. But I think that probably contributed to some of our challenges. And then, this experience versus a debacle, I like to call it I refer to it maybe as a debacle because in many ways it was. I keep the experience in here because I've gone to conferences to present this and have had our governor's office reach out and have the conference organizers try to change my title to experience instead of debacle, as they try to somewhat hide behind some of the failures that ensued. And so I like to keep this in here just as a reminder that operating in this social political space can be quite contentious and quite challenging from on high or on low from the public itself. And so I'll just sort of dive in, and I'm kind of I just want to give you sort of the big picture of some of the media that came out of this. This would be back in 2022 when a lot of this came out, and here we can see on the AP wire that Oregon's wildfire risk map emerges as a new climate flashpoint. That's important because it did get sort of caught up into this climate change debate pretty rapidly and unexpectedly when we were just trying to map where areas are more hazardous within the state, how quickly it becomes wrapped up in these climate change issues that are contentious and debatable and are, well, I wouldn't say the science is debatable, but the social policy and implications are debatable in our political sphere, and that sort of transitions a lot of this information, these data sets into that controversial space pretty quickly. Here's one from the GRIST where Oregon tried to inform residents about their wildfire risk, really again hazard, and the backlash really was explosive, as they would characterize it. And then ultimately, this would be back in, you can see August 5th, 2022, where swamped by public outcry, the state legislature withdrew the wildfire map. Here you can see that a depiction of it. And we'll get into some details about that here shortly. And then to sort of pause it really is what they did, and then try to reorganize a communication campaign and move it forward. But that, by the time we get to today, and this would be a recent article from, less than a month ago in ProPublica, where in this case, Rob Davis did a investigative reporting on this. And really concluded that this rapid spread of misinformation really pushed lawmakers and us to ultimately rescind this map and really rescind their efforts for community protection through codes and defensible space home hardening and that sort of thing. And so this sort of begs the question, how did we really get here? How did we get to this point? And so I want to go through some of this history of the development of all of this, and then of course we'll get into some other details in the media and that sort of thing about the pushback that we received. So this is just a depiction of then Governor Brown signing this legislation back in 2021. So it was really signed and then put into practice, July 12th or so of 2021. Initiating a 1-year, I guess, flurry of activity to develop this map and then ultimately deliver it to the state. And this was referred to as 2021 Senate Bill 762. And this is really what this legislation was about in sort of short order. It readjusted the state of Oregon's sort of state agency and I guess that to be adaptive to the changing climate and certainly this changing wildfire environment. So overall, the legislation influenced 11 state agencies, public health into our state fire marshals, our Department of Forestry, and many agencies in between that handle building codes, insurance, and that sort of thing. But Section 7 of that legislation was really about the mapping, and this is where they leaned on Oregon State University and therefore me to deliver products to support their efforts. And they really wanted 3 maps ultimately out of this. One was that we map the wildland urban interface itself. And then 2, we map social vulnerability. And then 3, we map what they called at the time wildfire risk, but really what they were asking for was wildfire hazard. And they wanted that to be driven by, specifically stated in the legislation, climate variability across the state, the weather, fuels, and topography, which are well-known factors that contribute to fire behavior. And then we were to classify said map into these 5 classes of risk, where there's no risk, low risk, moderate, high, and then extreme risk. And then put this up on a public platform, what we call the Oregon Wildfire Risk Explorer. It was a platform that existed and needed to be adapted specific for this need. And we had 1 year to do all of that. And then, there was an update, as I noted, that we'll talk about, but part of that was to change the words from risk to hazard. This is actually from the updated legislation to really I just wanted to bring forth because they wanted to reiterate the purpose of this map. And you can see here that they are to educate Oregon residents about their wildfire exposure, assist in prioritizing fire adaptation and mitigation resources, right? So we want to funnel those public investments to the areas that are most in need from both a exposure component as well as a social vulnerability component. So really try to blend those together. And then that ultimately at the same time identifies where defensible space standards and home hardening codes will apply, right? So there was both the carrot, right, to incentivize this adaptation through public investments, and then there was sort of the stick side of this, which was that if you fell inside both the wildland urban interface and a high hazard zone, that you would be required to, on new construction, build to new home hardening standards, and then to implement defensible space on your property. The defensible space component to this is retroactive in the sense that it's not only for new construction. The home hardening was only for new construction or significant remodels, but the defensible space would have to be implemented now on your property if it wasn't meeting the standards that the state fire marshal would ultimately come up with. And then our building codes division within the consumer department would address what home hardening standards should be. And so, like I said, it really initiated a single 1 year sort of rapid development of this. But I want to step back a little bit to where the impetus of even developing this and where our legislation came to this, and it really goes back into 2019 when Governor Brown at that time had initiated this Council on Wildfire Response, as they referred to it, which really took the cohesive strategy framework and set up these committees on resilient landscape and mitigation, adaptive communities, and then adjusting our wildfire response. And that committee went on for about roughly 9 months to a year. They developed a report on recommendations of how we could move the state forward, and this is ultimately what the Senate Bill 762 reflected. So it came from this really large effort. I served as a science liaison on the mitigation committee, and I could say just that single committee had probably 30 people operating on it to contribute to really the mitigation side of this. And then there were equivalent committees in those other two realms. And then the council itself that I think constitute roughly 20 experts, not just in wildfire, but in businesses all across the state of Oregon that have, that, and they took a really broad swath to address that, how fire or smoke or otherwise impacts just about every business sector within the environment. And that was a lot of who drove the actual council versus what were on those mitigation committees. So that was produced, and then they went into a short session early on in 2020 here in Oregon and tried to pass legislation to this effect. The same, basically the same legislation that ultimately passed, later in 2021. But they were unsuccessful for many reasons. In part, half our legislatures fled the state, and so we didn't have quorum, and so pretty much all legislative efforts stalled that first year. And maybe that was beneficial to the success of ultimately the legislation passing, because in 2020, much like California or Washington as well, we experienced a very significant wildfire event that had occurred on Labor Day. And we had, really 5 really big fires that blew up in those 2 days, burning, over 150,000 acres each, and some other smaller fires that were even more devastating, including the 2020 Alameda Drive fire that burned 2,800 structures in a 3,000 acre fire that started in the community of Ashland and burned into adjacent communities. And that little fire actually caused more damage to communities than the accumulation of all of those others that amounted to about 1 million acres in total burning in roughly 3 days because of that wind event. And then, of course, that happened all across the western states. So after that happened, it really falls into that sort of political window where you have that kind of that 1 year as a rule of thumb to really make some legislative moves as these kind of big issues are still on the minds of the public and our legislatures. And so, they successfully passed ultimately that Senate Bill 762 that I described in June, and then signed in July of 2021. And that initiated this 1-year process to develop those three maps, one being the hazard map, the other being the WUI and that sort. All of that then had to go through what was referred to as a Rules Advisory Committee. And we basically had bi-weekly 4-hour meetings with a 26-person advisory committee on defining how these maps were going to be created, right? So this is not something that was just created here at Oregon State University in a black box behind, some kind of wall. It was something that was deliberated for about 9 months. I think in total, the sum was about 66 and a half hours of open public debate about how we're going to define the wildland urban interface, how we're going to map that, what data sources we're going to use, how we're going to work through this process, with my role being to sort of hold to scientific practices and within the scope of the data that's available to us, and to make sure that the decisions that were being made could be accomplished and were legitimate within the scope of the scientific evidence and what data products we have and can use to create many of these maps. And so the rest of it was otherwise deliberated and determined by what amounted to a bunch of really lobbyists that were working on the legislation, whether they approved of it or not. And then they were at the table to try to continue to lobby on behalf of their constituents and get an outcome that they want in this space. And so, like I said, that went through about 9 months and then was finally approved. Honestly, it was finally approved, all the rules that were developed out of this, June 12th of 2022, which was about 18 days before we had to deliver these products. And so that meant that we were developing these tools and these data layers simultaneously as the rules are being developed, hoping that while we're producing these products, which take years and sometimes multiple years to develop, at the same time, and trying to make sure that those two systems sort of land at the end point where the rules match what we can do with the data, and we're creating the data so that we have time to actually deliver it in this approved time. So it's a sort of a really chaotic and sort of hard pushing environment. But we were successful at doing that because of the help of many people. And you can see sort of the end of this timeline here, and we'll revisit this timeline here shortly because more commenced thereafter. A big part of my role was to develop the science team to support this. Here's a list of the primary scientists here. So bringing in civil engineering because of their expertise in the built environment, bringing in rural economic development professors and staff that we had that are really good risk scientists and other analysts to support this effort. And you can see the list here. And then it wasn't just us here. We also contracted a lot of the fire behavior processing and analyzing to Pyrologics, now with Vibrant Planet, because they had the capacity to deliver this within that time frame. Originally, they said no, that it wasn't going to be possible, but we were able to work with them and find solutions to get there. And that's just because the data generation is so intensive and time consuming. And they did an absolutely great job. And of course, throughout that process, there's this really mass engagement with our fire management organizations, our fire behavior specialists across the state of Oregon and Washington to advise and inform and calibrate the models to reflect what they experience on the ground. And so we not only had the science wing, we had the advisory political wing, we had private industry engaged, and we had all of our fire management expertise brought to the table to inform this, to evaluate this, and to ensure that we're delivering the best product to the public that we can. Now, I had noted that we were talking a little bit about, the original legislation had referred to this as risk, and it really was a hazard. And I say that because here's three components that are important to ultimately developing a quote unquote risk map. And risk can be, sort of defined, and I'll talk about it a little bit later in many ways, at least in people's minds, but this is sort of how we looked at it, and how professionals that operate in this space would pursue risk from a perspective of wildfire to structures, is that you would address all three of these components. Now, we were really targeting burn probability and fire intensity in our hazard assessment, right? Because both are key ingredients, i.e., we need to know the likelihood of the event, and then we should understand that our fire managers engage in that, and that fire intensity also matters. And so accounting for variability in the fire intensity is also crucial to understanding the hazard as we would define it. What we can't really get to is that susceptibility side, because, and we could do some generalizations at best of this, related to fire intensity, i.e., a lower fire intensity fire is going to cause less damage than a high intensity fire. But beyond that, the susceptibility of the resource is really driven by the asset itself. And so the home hardening or the defensible space that exists for the asset itself. And we just don't have that level of information at that granular scale to be able to address susceptibility. And that's where we really see this being a difference between risk and hazard. And it's important because we continuously heard from the public that they were evaluating risk through the lens of susceptibility. And we'll talk about that with some maps in a little bit later. And that's a real challenge in this communication environment, and where the public is, how they perceive things, how they define these terms, and what the legislation and the need is, and what we're trying to accomplish, and how those two need to align and communicate with each other effectively to ultimately get to a sort of I guess, to get to that public benefit side of this legislation, to get it to implementation and success. So we developed those two layers for the hazard side, and here you can see a depiction of the burn probability map of the original one and the fire intensity map, so left and right. So ultimately, these two maps are multiplied together to get to a single value. Then that value we threshold into those categories. Originally 5, ultimately that was changed to 3. And when legislation updated this. So this is the two maps. These come out of, well-published methodologies that have been used for several decades, that were initially developed by the Missoula Fire Lab, and then has been advanced over the last close to 20 years now, using the large fire simulator, as well as a process that Pyrologics uses, which is the Wild West analysis, which is really a downscaling a lot of the fire intensity estimates to this, and then being able to basically create this gradient across the state of Oregon, that we can then apply the thresholds to, and identify those areas with the greatest exposure that really need to be adapted first as we start to build out this long-term statewide strategy towards resilience. And then through that Rural Advisory Committee, like I said, because ultimately the legislation and the regulations only apply to being in that high hazard zone and within the wildland urban interface. We had to come up with some rules of how you, map and then define that wildland urban interface. And this is a flow chart that does it. This is fairly standard modeling that we've become accustomed to, and how we define the wildland urban interface. Although you see some variations, and this was really built off of structure locations that fortunately Oregon had recently gone through a big effort to refine some of the Microsoft data sets and update them to be more accurate here in the state of Oregon, using LiDAR and other resources. And so we had a really good, structured data set present here in the Oregon that we were able to use within this density context, and then contrast that with its either being embedded within a lot of combustible vegetation, or being within a zone that's exposed to fires coming out of more wildland vegetation and propagating through a community. And that's usually categorized as 1.5 miles. That's somewhat of a subjective term that's become common, but we've seen fires certainly penetrate especially this year, deeper into a community. When you look at the Eaton fires, somewhat down in Southern California, where you're several miles into that community, and so the propagation to 1.5 miles is maybe not enough. But on top of that, there's also a linear reduction in the exposure estimates as you move farther into the community. So not only we do have that distance, but it isn't it isn't that the hazard zone is applied to that entire distance. There's a linear reduction in that. And so you see this sort of stair step down as you get farther into the community, which is consistent with how we see, fires burning into communities. And ultimately, what you can see here is the combination of those hazard maps that we saw before, the burn probability and intensity layer, after they've been multiplied together and then thresholded into these categories, and then the distribution of where our wildland urban interface is across Oregon. When you look at this, none of the gray space matters. What matters are the orange and red areas. Those are the areas that would be subject to this defensible space and home hardening standard. So a fairly narrow scope. We're really trying to drive this down to minimize that regulatory reach and those requirements so that we're not sort of over applying it, over regulating, if you will. Despite this narrow scope, we still receive that significant public backlash. And so this is all referring to the initial map that we laid out. It was about 4.4% of Oregon was within the wildland urban interface. And then about 23% of that wildland urban interface, this is by area, was within the higher extreme categories. And the higher extreme, they aren't treated differently, but those are the ones in the red and orange that would be subject to the regulation. It amounted to about 120,000 tax lots out of the 1.8 million across the state of Oregon, or 8.8% of the tax lots. And it was estimated that about 80,000 of those tax lots are currently built upon with a structure. And so if we were going to be looking at the defensible space, that's what we would be targeting is 80,000 structures across the state of Oregon out of roughly 2 million. So it's a little over 2 million structures that are in that structure data set. Now, this didn't go well. So this is what we delivered. We actually had to deliver this map that you see here. They needed it to be statewide, and that was something that the Department of Justice required. It's much more narrow in scope because much of this encompasses federal lands, non-occupied lands, and areas outside of what we would define as the wildland urban interface. But this is the map that was forward-facing in the public, in the media, that the public saw. And what happened is that when this was completed in June, then notification letters were sent out later in July to all of those residents that were subject to the new regulatory actions, defensible space and home hardening. And so there was a little bit of interest when it just hit the public, but once those letters hit people's mailboxes and they opened it, many of those individuals hadn't heard anything about what was going on, and they received this letter from the state saying, you are now at high hazard and you are subject to regulation. And then it had these 3 components listed to it. And this is where you start to heighten people's emotions and their sort of ready response to government actions, right? And there's 3 really important points here. Is one, that the letter states you have 60 days to appeal your risk classification. Again, it was risk at the time. It was then updated to hazard. We don't have home hardening building codes yet. The legislation specifically kicked those down to 3 months later, once the map was accepted in the public sphere. And then the defensible space codes were not coming for 6 months. So you have 60 days to appeal your hazard classification, but you don't know whether or not you currently already meet these standards or not, because we don't know what these standards are. And that was explicitly laid out in the legislation. I don't know why they laid it out in that fashion, because it would have been very helpful in our meetings to be able to communicate to individuals when we're rolling this map out that these are the steps that you will have to take. They may already be there. They may be planned already for individuals, and that could have led to, could have at least given them some certainty that this wasn't going to be, the end all to their property, but that didn't really play out that way. And then even through their updated legislative cycle, they didn't change this. They for some reason wanted to keep it separate. And that also created this sort of division between Oregon Department of Forestry and OSU, who are delivering the hazard map, and then these other state agencies that were responsible for defensible space or home hardening codes. And they would just stay separate of the controversy by saying, if there is no map, we don't have any codes, we have no role in this. And that sort of created a rift where we didn't have a cohesive sort of communication package or effort going forward between all the state agencies that were going to be involved in this effort. And so I'll just seed this right now is that I cannot overstate, excuse me, the importance of proactively communicating early and often. And then I'm going to show you some reasons why and why this thing really got derailed. And so, as I noted, we were working through that rules advisory committee from about, I guess it would be August in 2021 all the way through ultimately June of the following year, and then delivering the map a couple weeks later. By October of that first year, and this is coming even from a member on the Rules Advisory Committee, information is going out that is really sowing some distrust and fear in the public. And I've highlighted three components here that were not true, that did not play out, that were being pushed by these lobbyists, that benefit from having, of course, constituents paying them and all this sort of thing for their efforts. But it was really misinformation that was going out, and was going out within months of even this effort to build a map, let alone, well in advance of the delivery of this map or the delivery of this data and this information. And some of it, that was really important to the people of Oregon is that you're going to have to remove, say, your crops if you're a farmer, and all your managed timber and all of this, all of your beautiful landscaping is going to have to be removed if you're in this class that's being regulated. None of that being true, when we now see some of these regulations, they will not require anybody that is growing crops or any of that to have to remove those away from their property within that defensible space zone, let alone anywhere else on that property. We see these ranches down here that they're saying, you've got a couple barns and you're going to be considered in the wildland urban interface. That was just to sow fear that anything is going to fall into it. Not true. These were all excluded from consideration as being WUI in the state. And then this idea that you're going to immediately have to spend $100,000 on your property. And that, of course, would astonish anybody. And so this is being sent out, this misinformation, this fear campaign, to start to rile up that public backlash. And that public backlash came not only from these perspectives, but also from others. One of the biggest ones, and this really came out of one of our first public meetings after the map rollout. We were going to go down to Southwest Oregon, Josephine, Jackson counties, and we were going to present to the public and discuss what this map is and what it's about. And because we received threats of violence to us, the state police wouldn't allow us to go in person, so we transitioned that to a virtual environment. And we had a Zoom meeting much like this, but it had, I think, 1,500 people on it to come and listen, and maybe more importantly, to come and yell at us and complain, which they did. And one individual came on and said that within 2 days of releasing of the map, that his insurance company dropped him from insurance coverage. Now, I can attest that no insurance company has reached out or asked about the map. I have the data. They've never received the map or the data. They only have it through the media or on the online platform. There was no way that within 2 days these premium decisions were being made off of our map. And we ultimately did survey, our Department of Financial Regulation surveyed all of the insurance companies, and none of them were using this in any way. But that didn't prevent that narrative from going out. And it really started with this one individual who drew that conclusion, and then the media that was present at that Zoom meeting then amplifying it. And so it became an insurance issue really fast. And it says, and then we see this right into the media as a stated fact, right? So Oregon sends homeowners insurance rates skyrocketing. Completely untrue, proven time and time again to be untrue. And yet it was stated with fact, and it really took over the narrative of what was going on. And of course, this also led to property value conversations in a very similar sense, that because you're now characterized as having high hazard, that you're also losing value in your home. And this really leads to and adds to that $100,000 worth of work perspective that I acknowledged in that sort of misinformation campaign that was going out early. And you can imagine that a individual receives this letter that they're in this, they're told that they're going to have to spend $100,000. Now they're told they're not going to have homeowners insurance, and their value of their property isn't going to decline. And they're looking at, this direct impact of, maybe $200,000, maybe more, right to their livelihoods, to their home value, where most Americans, store their wealth. And then it becomes the map, it instantly becomes the hazard that they're fighting against. So now the data that we're producing is the hazard. Wildfire itself is no longer the hazard. And that became the driving force behind much of the opposition. And we could never really dig out of that, no matter how hard we tried, including things like, this, right? And this really these were public flyers that were going around as they're, doing these grassroots sort of efforts to fight back against it. And most of it is, your private property is at risk, not from wildfire so much as government overreach, right? And this really started to drive this narrative. And there was no counter narrative to that. There was nobody out there communicating effectively on behalf of the state and the legislatures as to the benefits of going down this path, the pathways in which they're going to minimize these impacts to the communities. And so I'll just throw this out there that on top of all of that, that's sort of the misinformation world. We also realize that risk perceptions vary greatly across all the public. And therefore, when you throw out a hazard map, they're going to look at this, they're going to look at this data and look at this information, and they're going to interpret it through their cognitive lens, right? And so they're going to have their own ideas of what risk is, how they've maybe accepted it at their home location, or done what they're willing to do to mitigate that themselves. And then they're going to get a map that may be contrary to that or different than their perspectives. And that's going to lead to a lot of challenges. And that's not only just, the perception of risk, like and their own personal risk. It's also in how they think about the problem and therefore think about the solution. And this is a great example of that. This comes from, at the time, a House Republican leader that says these maps are arbitrary and they don't deal with the problem in our forests. And so we need to stop classifying land and putting on burdensome regulations, and we need to get back to forest management. And of course, if you look at the science and the data, it is not, homes are not primarily lost in the forest or from public lands. They're really, homes are lost often most often in grass and shrub field types, where most of our homes exist, in valleys or, in so open space of the Midwest and that sort of thing. And so forests really aren't the source of the problem. They can be, but they aren't the dominant source of the problem. And the science is fairly clear on that. But people still have this narrative, and this goes back to, in Oregon, a lot of our timber wars efforts, where all the problems are because the environmental community has stopped forest management. And it leads to this idea that forest management is fire management. But the data shows that forest management is not fire management. Despite fire management being a significant land management decision, if you will. But this is going out as public sort of fact, right, from leaders, and this is further entrenching opposition against this data that's being put out. Others, like you see here, flaws in the map, including designating irrigated lands under center pivots as extreme risk. Here you can see this actually statement came out in August. This is being August 5th of 2022 when they put it. And just 2 days before, this fire had ignited under a center pivot. that had previously been irrigated and then harvested, and here it is, and burned up homes, right? So, we see this information going out at the same time when we see reality playing out that is completely opposite. And that seems to be the state of where we're at today, in a lot of our, what would be data-driven decisions and people's opposition to it. And they can just say the opposite of what's even happening out there. And that's intriguing. We were actually at a public meeting during this time where many of the attendees had to leave to attend this fire, in various ways, either as private landowners or firefighters themselves. And yet we can say the opposite of the reality of what's happening. But possibly more important in this risk perception world is this notion that we have hazard, like you see on the left, as we mapped it, versus this idea of susceptibility, which this is a map of susceptibility within a community on the right, and people really stepping out and saying, you know what, I look at my property and this is my susceptibility, and that's how I'm going to define risk, when in fact we're trying to define hazard and that exposure, and then who should be adaptive. And those two components were in contrast and battling each other. And we could not get past this notion that you can assess the likelihood of experiencing a wildfire just by looking out for your front porch, right? But that's what they're really looking at, is their susceptibility. So this complete different understanding of what the map was intended to do, and people looking at it through a lens that is not consistent with what the data is and what the legislative need is from data to look at hazard and narrow that scope. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that risk really incorporates the infrastructure susceptibility, that wildfire hazard or exposure side, and in many circles, the social vulnerability as well, the ability for the individual to adapt and recover from that. And so we reorganized and went through a new process where we revised the map, took in public feedback, worked directly with counties for over 6 months probably. They had over a year to really feedback and provide feedback on it, worked directly with counties. And then we went through these resource fairs to reach the public. We seemed like we were going to land it at that level of engagement at a much more local scale, where a lot of the opposition came, where people were starting to understand it. But at some point, a key senator decided that he was going to back away from that, and that really opened the floodgates for retraction ultimately of this map, which had been updated to the map on the right that did include more influence of irrigation, something that we viewed as a mitigation action, but that they wanted in the map, so we included that. It didn't change things all that much, but ultimately we came down to this challenge where the map was ultimately rescinded. And I'm just going to put this one because I did get some positive, response from individuals in a quite a humorous way. But sometimes you do have fans, even in all of the hatred. Ultimately, the misinformation won out. Just about 2 months ago, the map has been fully retracted. And so I'll just leave you with this sort of one simple sort of, chart that shows some of the challenges that we face. And as a scientist, we often think of ourselves as informing policy, and then the policy informs the public. In this case, we saw science also get in between that communication between the policy and the public. So it wasn't, science did inform the policy, but then the policy relied on a scientific-based or data-driven map to inform that decision-making that they were doing. That fed into the media, that fed into the public, and then there was great backlash from that. And we were at the center of it, and everybody sort of stepped away and allowed the scientists, and then by extension, Oregon Department of Forestry, take all the arrows, and they didn't come together and coalesce around this idea and the importance of community resilience to move this forward. And without aligning all these systems and having that support in advance of all of this coming out, you're likely to be doomed by many of the actors out there that are trying to misinform it. And so getting those aligned, and these may be non-traditional, they certainly are for data scientists and other scientists, but we need to get into the media and work with them and effectively communicate across our politicians, our media, and to the public, either directly or via those avenues. And getting that system aligned is key to success in today's sort of political environment, where where data science is advancing really fast and can support sound decision making. But then there's this sort of receiver side of this communication pipeline. Data is effectively communication in this environment, particularly when you're producing maps. But you have to understand that there's a receiver side to that, and that receiver side may be in a very different state of understanding of the issues and what you're trying to create to support these efforts, and aligning those systems is critical to success.